Review Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. She is the author of the book The Sculptor and the Saint, no other than Miss Lori Joan Swick.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate having the chance to talk about my work. It means a lot to me.
Welcome to Book 101, Miss Lori, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Well, I write historical fiction novels about women whose religious agency I feel like has been undervalued. And Cecilia of Rome is one that she was considered the first and the Virgin of Saints in the line of the chorus. And she kind of set the standard, the pattern for the virgin martyrs in the Catholic Church and in the Christian Church, actually. And I really feel like what happened to her and other people like her throughout history has become sort of the standard for some gender interpretations for women in today's world. So that's why I felt like it was important to write about her. My background is I have a doctorate in philosophy and religion with a specialization in women's spirituality. And I've just been history buff forever. And St. Cecilia's been important to me since I was very young. So this book was a total labor of love.
Labor of love indeed. Miss Lori Joan Swick, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. What was the initial seed of inspiration for the sculptor and the saint? Was it a specific historical figure, a piece of art, or a personal question, or something else entirely?
Well, it was kind of a lot of those things. When I was 10 years old, I was raised in the Catholic school, in the Catholic Church. And when we were confirmed, we were supposed to choose a saint to be our patron saint. In other words, we actually take them as part of our name. And I chose Saint Cecilia because she is a patron saint of music, and I like to play the piano and sing. And as I got older, I realized that even though I kind of always felt close to her, and you see her in art, she's highly celebrated in art, but very little is known about her. And I thought, gosh, I really want to learn more about her. So I started doing research and found out, except for her passion, the very, very romanticized, if you will, violent story of how and why she was murdered, martyred, if you were, by the church. Or by the world at her time, by the Roman world. And when I really got into looking at it, there wasn't much out there. But I finally, when I did my master's degree at the University of Notre Dame, in the library there, they had archives with the original documents of what happened to her. And so here I finally had it in my hands. The original writings of Baronius, who was a historian that wrote about her, of Antonio Bosio, the Lion of the Catacombs, that wrote about her. And I was able to start piecing together what her life might have really been like. Then, as I got into my research, I realized that you really can't read much about her without reading about Stefano Maderno of Rome. He lived in 1599. He was 23 years old when the Pope commissioned him to sculpt her likeness. And he had to actually attend, and this is actual, they opened her casket. She would have been dead for 1,300 years. And they exhumed her body. And this is practice in the Catholic Church. This is done regularly when somebody is a saint or when they're dedicating a church to someone. But they exhumed her body, and he had to look at her 1,300-year-old remains and sculpt her likeness from that. And this is a picture on the book of his statue that he sculpted, and they said she was completely inviolate. In other words, it looked like she had just died, believe it or not. So anyway, that's sort of the fantastical underpinnings of the story. So who could resist but write a book about that? So
Definitely.
it's dual timeline. It takes place in ancient Rome during Saint Cecilia's time, and in Renaissance Rome when Stefano Maderno was sculpting her likeness, and just sort of the affinity that he gets from her, and the things that he goes through learning about her life as he sculpts her statue, and that's kind of the dynamic of the novel.
Miss Laurie, the title suggests two central figures. How do you approach balancing the sculpture's journey with the saint's legacy? Whose perspective felt more challenging in Hibbett?
Well, they both led challenging lives. Again, very little is actually known about Stefano. I had to, based on what I did know about him, I had to kind of put his life together. But I originally wrote the book and it was just about Stefano. And then I went back and put Cecilia in it because I thought it was important. What interweaves the narratives is as Stefano is sculpting, Antonio Bocio, who I mentioned before, was updating what they knew about her. They call it the Passion. It's a story of their martyrdom, of their death, and what they went through and what they said at the very end of their lives. And he was collecting what little they had in Latin and putting it together and kind of making her story. And as he was doing that, he and Stefano Maderno became friends. And in my novel, he was sharing what he was learning with Stefano. Well, as Stefano learns more and more about her, and she, as in the story, of course, in her passion, it says she was a virgin. It says, that she did these mighty works of martyrdom, was very Christ-like, and so Stefano tries really, really hard to be this pure, like she was, to be worthy of just handling her and touching her and working on her. And it gets into sort of a really mystical rhythm with his work. And I had to do a lot of research on the sculpting process, which was really fun and rewarding. But as he's working on it, he's trying to be like her. And of course, he can't. He's 23 years old. He's trying to fast. He's trying to be celibate, runs in all sorts of trouble there. But while he's learning the story of her life, I juxtapose that with going back and talking about what I think really happened to her, which I think was very, very different than what was celebrated throughout the centuries in the church about her. So that's how I interweave it. What he's learning, what society knows about her, what history believes about her, and I'm going back and trying to paint the picture of, based on what we know now about that life and time. And so much we've learned from anthropological studies. We can tell so much more now than we could for a long time. So I'm going back and weaving in what I think she really went through. In her passion, it says when she was married, during the ceremony, she was married to a statesman who probably would have been much older than she was, because that was the practice back then. But it said that she sang in her heart to God to save her and to keep her inviolate, to make sure she was always a virgin. And this, it portrays that she really did that, which is probably very highly unlikely. But just these sort of things I went back through and put in her life, which probably at that time, as a young daughter of a very rich Roman patrician, would have been, there would have been some privileges, but it would have been very controlled.
Beautifully, beautifully articulated, Miss Laurie, and interesting indeed. Saints are often depicted idealistically. How did you strive to portray your saint as a complex, relatable human being while honoring their spiritual significance?
Well, I tried to put myself in her place. Again, as I was saying, we can tell more about life was like in ancient Rome. The stories say she was married to a young patrician, and it made it sound really wonderful, like a wonderful romance. But when we go back and look at the art of the time, and especially like in cemeteries, when we can see where people were buried, younger women were married off to older men. As soon as in that particular society, as soon as a young girl was old enough to bear children, she was usually married. She was married to somebody older. A lot of women died in childbirth, so this was common practice. So in my story, she was promised to somebody that was older, as a sort of a bargain of her father's political ploy in her world. And it was not what she would have had done by any means. And according to the story, there was the prefect was the one who actually did the trying, and the ancient Romans at the time. Of course, Christians were at that time they were being persecuted in ancient Rome, so they had to be careful what they did. But I believe that she became Christian, or might have become Christian if we look at the pattern, what was going on at that time, because she was trying to avoid having to be married to somebody she really didn't want to be married to. And if a young girl said she was a Christian and was married to Christ, in her mind, she felt like that would keep her from having to get married. But of course, it didn't. So.
Miss Laurie, what were the most profound internal conflicts driving your sculptor protagonists? What made them compelling to write?
I, Thinking about him being 23 years old and having this commission, which was huge at the time, he was hailed as the greatest sculptor in all of Rome. So, I mean, that must have been a lot of pressure for this young man. And he's learning about this young saint, this beautiful saint, and he's doing this gorgeous, and really what he did, he sort of led them out of the mannerism into the Rococo. He was a very important sculptor at his time, even though through history he hasn't been regaled as much. But as he's doing this and he's trying to be perfect and get the sculpture perfect for the Pope who's hired him, for everybody who's counting on him. But he's also, as he's learning Saint Cecilia's story, he's kind of falling in love with her. Not just with her, but the concept of her purity, of the fact that she can do what he can't in his mind from what he's learning, that she can give herself totally to God, and that she can be perfect in so many ways. And she's little. I mean, the story of her is being married, but when they go and they exhume her body, when you look at the dimensions of the coffin, she was probably no more than a child. So he's having all this emotional conflict as he's handling this form and working on it, and just sort of, following the romanticized stories of her life, and trying to be something he's not. He's trying to be perfect like he thinks Cecilia was. And it makes him almost mad, without giving away too much of the actual storyline.
Definitely.
Mhm.
And Miss Laurie, who is supporting character you particularly enjoyed writing, or who plays a crucial, perhaps unexpected, role in shaping the main character's journey?
Well, it's hard to say. I enjoyed Cardinal Sfondrati, who was the titular, they call him. He was the cardinal who took on Cecilia's name, and he was the one who rebuilt her basilica. He was the one that arranged to have her body exhumed. He knew she had been buried somewhere under the church by a previous pope, and he looked and looked until he found her. And he was just, kind of, in my book, kind of nutty about relics. In other words, he opened the coffins, and a lot of this, we know is true. They did this. They would open it and actually play with the corpses, and they'd take little shavings of bone or a little bit of hair, and they would put it in reliquaries and put it around the churches. And it's kind of a mad thing, but this belief that if you're close to someone, a saint who's deceased, it somehow makes you holy too, was huge in the church at that time, in the Renaissance, and still is to a very large degree today. And so his sort of fascination with her. I really enjoyed Sfondrati, and his he had some exchanges with Stefano Maderno that I think really shaped Stefano's experience in carving the statue. And he was a character that I enjoyed and I had a lot of fun with, for sure. Another character I really enjoyed, and I pulled her out of my head because I didn't know that much about Cecilia and who was in her life, but she would have had a maidservant because she was a patrician's daughter, and her maidservant and her, were young girls who formed this sort of a bond that really became sisterly to Cecilia as she went through all her trials and tribulations. And so I really enjoyed coming up with and creating that character to kind of help Cecilia go through the changes of her young life.
Miss Laurie, how important was the historical and physical setting to the story atmosphere and themes, and how did you bring it to life?
Um, I'd say it's really important. We do know uh, Cecilia lived according to her passion, what we know about her, she lived in the very place that is now her basilica. So, in other words, where they exhumed her body, and the Pope was there, and the cardinals were there, Stefano was there. Where they did that was actually in the house that she was believed to have lived in with her husband after she married. So her basilica was made over the site that was believed to be her house. When I went to Rome, I walked through it, and then you could go underneath and you could see like a house, and you could see the tile, and you could see certain things. And where her body is interred would have been, if the story is true, where she actually lived. So, within this whole pulsing thing where she's now buried and she's now interred, underneath the crypt of the church in the house where she was married. What went on in this house is is very huge. I mean, it's really big. If you go into her basilica now, all the reliquaries are there. Another really important character was Sebastian of Milan, who I made, who wasn't martyr at the time. He's the one who's the patron saint of athletes, but he's the one, when you see statues, he's always got arrows in him. That's Stefan. That's Sebastian. I made a little love interest between her and Sebastian, which really helped me to carry the story forward, and helped me also kind of show what went on with young men who were martyrs at the time, and not just with Cecilia. But the interesting thing about that is, even though there's no real historical evidence of that, anywhere you go where Cecilia is, he's there. When you walk into her church and you go into the caldarium where she was martyred, you see this huge statue of Sebastian kind of standing guard there. Where she was buried in the catacombs for centuries, right over where she was interred, is it's a painting, and Sebastian of Milan is in the middle of it, like he's watching over what's going on. Where she was buried in the catacombs, coincidentally, is right underneath the apse of Saint Sebastian's church. So it's like wherever she is, in death, he's there looking over her. So that was kind of fun, developing that aspect of her character and that romantic relationship. But to that extent, the setting was really important.
Definitely. Setting for sure is important. And Miss Laurie, as an author, what are your short term and long term goals?
Um, I have another novel that's almost completely finished called The Snake Priestess, which I plan to publish next year. I want to continue writing books about women in religious history that I think were important, that started religious or spiritual movements, and just weren't were remembered the way that they deserve to be. I'm researching a book on Nefertiti of Egypt. I'm researching a book on Helena Blavatsky of Russia, who kind of started the occultist movement during the Enlightenment. She's a very, very interesting person. So I'm having a lot of fun just doing this, and I plan to just keep doing it as long as I can.
Good luck to your goals, Miss Laurie,
Thank you.
and looking forward for more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there want to be an author like you?
Well, thank you for saying that. My advice would be, just keep writing. Don't wait till everything's perfect. It never will be. Find your time of day to do it, and just keep doing it. Mine is first thing in the morning. I get up and make my coffee, and before I start getting other things in my head or checking emails, I just sit down for at least an hour and write. And just keep doing it. You're everything you write isn't going to be perfect, but you have to get through all that other writing to get to what will be perfect. And if you just keep generating it, you just have to do it to keep moving forward.
Definitely. And thank you for your advice, Miss Laurie. And can you please recommend a book that influenced your journey?
I'm sorry.
Can
Uh,
you please uh, save the books that influence your journey? Can you
oh, the books
recommend?
that influenced my journey. Oh,
Yes.
yes. When I was growing up, I loved to read historical fiction. Taylor Caldwell's Dear and Glorious Physician, at a very young age, had a big impression on me. I as really getting into talking about women in religious history and spirituality, Carol P. Christ, who I had the good fortune of studying with when I was doing my doctorate, uh, wrote an essay actually called "Why Women Need the Goddess," which really, really kind of shone light to me on, you know, the way that women had been raised in patriarchal religious traditions and why they might need something that's, a little more fitting to their needs in life. That was very influential on me too. There were a lot of them throughout history, but again, I've always loved historical fiction, and I loved works about women in religion.
Thank you for your recommended books, Miss Laurie, and hoping our listeners and viewers will read it and they will for sure empower. The book inherently explores the intersection of artistic creation of a spiritual devotion. How do these forces interact? Do they clash, implement, or complement, or transform each other in your story?
In my story, when I write fiction, now I do have a nonfiction book about dreaming as a sacred art, but everything I write, the religious aspect, I'm interested in the anthropological aspect of religion. Okay. Um, how our spirituality forms who we are, how that forms culture. I am not advocating any certain religion. I'm certainly not proselytizing or trying to get anybody to think a certain way. I'm just really interested in religious structures and how they have formed societies, how they have formed cultures. And I'm really into the rich cultural aspect of religious studies and spiritual studies and what that does for the human soul and the mind. What do we mean when we say there's a God? How many different ways can we view that there's a God? Are we all getting what we need from the religious systems that we have and the belief systems that we're taught? These are the things that are important to me. And I mostly am interested in going back and finding women's stories within religions that were very patriarchal, or they're basically written by men for men. Not that anything's wrong with that, but I think there were a lot of women in there who were very important who kind of got glossed over, and it's really important to me to go back and say, okay, well, they did this and this was really wonderful, and this might not have happened if they hadn't, that sort of thing. So because women were really really important in the development of the world's spiritual traditions, the world's cultural traditions, and the world's religious traditions. So my job, I feel like, is to celebrate that.
Definitely. Let's celebrate for sure. And what kind of research was involved? Did you discover anything particularly surprising or transformative during this phase, Miss Laurie?
The research, like I said, was quite a journey. I think I told you I ended up at Notre Dame in the library, and uh, looking at the actual first documents that were written at the time that Stefano lived, that were being written while he was actually sculpting the statue, and that was huge. And then there were two trips to Rome. I went back to Rome and I went to all these places. I went to her basilica after working on this book for so long and thinking about her. Standing in front of Stefano's statue was very moving, but actually going down into the crypt and being close to where she interred was really a magical experience for me. It was very otherworldly. But I did go all over Rome and go to these places and do a tremendous amount of research. And it was mind boggling. As I said, just walking through what would have been her house was just it was just an amazing experience for me.
Definitely. And Miss Laurie, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well. Geography 101 in each third season, and my baby podcast, Law 101 and Mental Health 101. Love Letters in its third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in its fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. Miss Laurie, does the story of the sculptor and the saint feel complete, or do their journeys continue to linger and evolve for you as the author?
I think they'll linger for me forever because I worked on this book and this story for so many years that it's definitely a part of my life. But I do feel like what I had to say about Cecilia and about Stefano and about this time and about her importance is complete in that particular book. So I'll just put that out there for the world to see if to see how they feel about it. But that's what I have to say about Cecilia right there. And I'm on to working with other women.
Definitely, Miss Lori Joan Swick. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books, your advocacy, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Thank you, Daniel. Now, if you go over to my website at lorijoanswick.com, be sure and sign up for a sneak peek at my next novel, The Snake Priestess. I think you'll really enjoy it. Also, watch for my video blog. It's called She Started It. And I celebrate different women in religious history. This particular month, I'm working on Evelyn Underhill and talking about what she taught the world about mysticism. And that's a lot of fun. So be sure and check that out too.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Lori John Swick because if you support her, more and more empowering books to come. So, Miss Lori, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Mordecai people, see you soon.